I don't remember the last time someone used my full name without reading it off a paper. The receptionist called it out flatly, not bothering to meet my eyes. I stepped into the conference room already hearing the murmur of voices before the door had fully closed behind me. The table was long polished, too formal for what it was about to hold. Matthew and Chelsea sat near the end, across from Mr. Bell, whose leather briefcase was still unlatched. They didn't look up. It took a moment for me to realize there were no extra pleasantries. No mom over here. No gesture toward a seat. Just 3 chairs on my side of the table. One of them was empty. I took the one farthest from them and placed my purse on the floor. The strap had softened over time, cracked where my fingers always gripped it. I folded my hands together. One thumbnail still had flour under it from the banana bread I baked that morning, out of habit, not invitation. Mr. Bell cleared his throat. "Let's begin." He didn't ask if I was ready. I suppose there was no need. He started with the formalities, the deceased, the date the document filed and witnessed. Then came the names. To Evelyn Harper, the ranch property in Morgan County. No mention of the 42 years of marriage, of the long hospital nights, of the times I'd driven Walter out there with coffee and aspirin when his back acted up. Just the land. One sentence. Chelsea shifted slightly. I saw her mouth twitch before she tilted her head toward Matthew, then back at the lawyer. Her voice was soft, performative. "Well, now she has somewhere to go." There was no reaction. The lawyer kept reading. Matthew didn't flinch. "It's quiet out there," she continued, adjusting the cuff of her blouse. Probably more her pace anyway. Not a single person at the table looked at me. To Matthew Harper and Chelsea Harper, jointly the residents on Clearview Drive, all remaining checking and investment accounts, insurance disbursements, and personal property not otherwise specified. I felt the sentence lodge somewhere beneath my ribs, like a small stone I hadn't known I swallowed. Chelsea turned toward the lawyer again. "And the vehicle, the Ford Explorer, is included under joint personal assets." Chelsea smiled. "We'll probably sell it. Too outdated." Then she glanced at me. "Unless you want to keep driving something from the 90s, I didn't respond. I think I might have blinked. Walter had always liked that car, called it dependable. He never cared that the radio only worked if you hit the dash twice. Matthew finally spoke. "It's what Dad wanted." The sentence hung in the air, barely directed at anyone. It wasn't defense. It wasn't kindness. It was just a line he'd decided to use, like something a publicist might hand out before a press conference. Mr. Bell went over a few more documents. I nodded when necessary. Signed one page with a pen I'd brought from home, silver, slightly bent at the tip. Walter used to borrow it for crosswords and leave it on the porch railing. When it was finished, Chelsea glanced at her phone. "We can come by Saturday," she said. "Help pack up. Or send someone if that's easier." Her voice was coated in a type of patience people only use when they've already decided you're unreasonable. I adjusted the strap of my purse, ran my fingers along the stitching. "No, thank you." Matthew stood. That was the end. Just like that. They walked ahead of me through the narrow hallway. Chelsea put on her sunglasses with both hands, like she was drawing a curtain over the rest of the morning. Matthew held the door open for her. He didn't turn around. I stayed a moment longer. My coat had slipped off one shoulder. I fixed it and buttoned the top clasp. The fabric was a little worn at the seams. I hadn't replaced it in years. I thought of the envelope on the table, Walter's name printed in all caps. No handwriting. No personal note. Just the stamp of process and a schedule to keep. There was one chair still empty, the one beside me. I'd been looking at it on and off for the past hour. It hadn't moved. Walter used to sit beside me in meetings like this, even the small ones. Parent-teacher conferences. Credit union appointments. He always folded his arms and tapped his ring against the underside of the table. I could never tell if it was a nervous habit or a kind of punctuation. Now there was just the chair. When I stepped out into the hallway, the receptionist gave me a quick glance. Not rude, not warm, just enough to mark the end of something. The door shut behind me with a soft click. I walked down the front steps slowly. The sun was too sharp on the concrete, but I didn't reach for my sunglasses. I'd forgotten them again, I think. Or maybe I just didn't need them anymore. The courthouse clock across the square chimed. 11 times. I counted them without trying to. I hadn't been early. I hadn't been late. I had arrived exactly on time and still missed something. At the corner, a little boy was holding a balloon, tugging at his mother's hand. She didn't notice. The balloon floated upward as she pulled him across the street. It caught on a power line before bursting. No one turned. I don't think I expected a different outcome. I just hadn't imagined I would feel quite so unnecessary. And maybe that's the most silent kind of absence, when you've been removed so completely that even your echo isn't welcome. I always believed that if I stayed helpful, I'd stay needed. Not essential, just adjacent enough to be called in when a chair needed wiping or a dish needed garnishing. I never minded the quiet tasks. They didn't make anyone uncomfortable. They didn't leave marks or require thanks. I knew where the spare paper towels were kept. I remembered which grandchild wouldn't eat peas. I always brought the nut-free pie, even when no one mentioned the allergy anymore. The pie dish came back clean most times. Once it was untouched, but still scrubbed and stacked with the others. Chelsea met me at the door, holding a tray of cupcakes in pastel liners. "They're from the bakery by the park," she murmured. "Just easier." I nodded. I held the dish in both hands and walked it back to the car, still warm from the oven. Easier had a way of closing every other door. At their kitchen table, once I reached to pick up a dropped spoon, and Chelsea caught sight of my wrist. She tilted her head as if measuring something. "Mom, that sweater looks a little worn. Let me order you something soft, maybe merino." She didn't touch it, just made a note on her phone and moved on. It was the sweater Walter bought me for our 35th anniversary, blue with threadbare elbows. It still held the faintest trace of the cedar chest where I used to keep it folded. I wore it when I wanted to feel dignified, but quiet. I stopped wearing it after that afternoon. There was a birthday once. I'd brought balloons, paper lanterns in shades of yellow and mint green. Chelsea looked at the box without opening it. "We're going with white and silver this year. Neutral feels more curated." The word curated hung in the air like a wall I couldn't pass through. I left the box in the trunk of my car unopened. I used to carry knitting needles in my purse, small ones for idle moments. When Lily was 3, I made her a scarf the color of wild buttercups. She wore it once, maybe twice. Then I found it folded in a bin in the hall closet with a sticky note on top. "Too scratchy, replace with cotton blend." The handwriting was Chelsea's. I didn't say anything. I just put the needles away and started buying picture books instead. At Thanksgiving, I offered to carve the turkey the way Walter used to do it. Matthew blinked and said nothing. Chelsea smiled, one of those half moons without teeth, and handed me a salad bowl instead. "Could you toss this, the turkey's kind of a centerpiece moment for the kids?" I held the wooden spoon like a flag I hadn't meant to raise. Once at bedtime, Henry tugged at my sleeve and whispered, "Why doesn't Mommy want you to sleep over?" I opened my mouth, then closed it again. His pajama top had cartoon foxes on it, orange and bold. I smoothed his collar and kissed his forehead. That was my answer. I tried to offer advice just once about screen time. "Maybe fewer cartoons would help him sleep," I murmured, after Henry cried through the night. Chelsea stood by the sink rinsing glasses. "Things are different now," she said without turning. "We have it under control." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She just rinsed, stacked, and dismissed. After that, I brought folded laundry instead of suggestions. Socks matched by color. Towels creased along the grain. I stopped commenting on discipline on nutrition on bedtime routines. I started asking permission to bring things. Would it be all right if I picked them up from school next week? Do you already have plans for Lily's birthday, or should I step back? Once, Chelsea smiled faintly. We've got it covered, but thanks. Covered. A word like tarp or gauze. A word that meant there was nothing left to do. They remodeled the living room the year Walter passed. New furniture, cooler tones framed prints of abstract leaves. The family photo over the fireplace showed Matthew, Chelsea, Lily, and Henry in matching denim. I looked for myself in the background. There was no background. I asked about the picture I'd gifted them, Walter, holding Lily on his lap, both of them laughing over a toy xylophone. Chelsea blinked. Oh, I think it's in a drawer somewhere. We're going for clean lines now. The xylophone had made a tinny sound. Walter hated it, but he played along anyway, pretending to be a conductor, while Lily giggled on repeat. That frame was cherry wood carved by hand, wrapped in brown paper, and tied with string the year I gave it. I remembered a barbecue where Chelsea's parents arrived in matching hats. Her mother brought deviled eggs garnished with paprika in perfect diagonal strokes. I had made lemonade from scratch. She brought sparkling cider in glass bottles with hand-drawn tags. People love the fizz, she whispered to Matthew. I poured myself a glass of water and stood behind the serving table. They never forgot to thank her. The last gift I gave that didn't vanish was a houseplant. It still sits by their kitchen window. A pothos in a white ceramic pot. The tag I'd written, "Low Light for Giving," had been peeled off. Once, I offered to help plan Christmas dinner. Chelsea looked up from her tablet. You don't need to trouble yourself. Just relax and enjoy. I made a cranberry tart anyway. Left it by the sink uncut. No one touched it. I wiped down the counters after the party. There was flour on my sleeve again, and no one noticed. I used to think presence was enough. That showing up, listening closely, offering small things, that these gestures would keep me tethered to them even gently. But sometimes a rope phrase, not because it snaps, but because it's been rubbed too thin to hold anything anymore. And by the time it gives way, it doesn't even make a sound. I used to think small things held the world together. There was a card on the table once. Pale blue with a cartoon dog wearing a party hat. Inside, in Chelsea's handwriting, it said, "To the best grandparents, thank you for being part of our journey." Beneath it were 4 names: Matthew, Chelsea, Lily, and Henry. No signature, no date, just those lines in fine black ink. Walter had already been gone 5 years by then. I traced my thumb along the edge of the envelope, as if maybe the address label might carry a separate intention. It didn't. I placed the card in the drawer with the rubber bands and expired coupons, thinking maybe I'd forget it there. I didn't. There was a photo I loved once. I took it myself during an autumn picnic behind the school gym, Matthew balancing Henry on his shoulders, while Lily tried to feed ducks with a piece of apple. The light was soft that day, almost forgiving. I had it printed, framed it in a carved wooden border with a leaf motif, something Walter and I had picked up at a roadside antique shop. I wrapped it with tissue and handed it over after dinner one night. Months later, I found it upside down behind the bookshelf. The glass was dusty. A few crumbs had settled along the frame. I stood in the hallway holding it, unsure if I should mention it or quietly fix it. I did neither. I returned it to where I'd found it. At a school open house, Lily's teacher stopped me by the refreshment table. "Your granddaughter is such a delight." She said you helped her with the fraction worksheet, I nodded, brushing a crumb from my scarf. Chelsea, standing nearby, turned without pause. "She gets all her discipline from my mother. Honestly, I don't know what I'd do without her support." I smiled. I'd brought the peanut-free cookies in my bag, still unopened. I left them on the table and walked outside before the bell rang. The hallway smelled like whiteboard cleaner and starch. There had been a day in spring when I ran into our old neighbor, Ellen Boyd, at the market. We used to share canning jars. She asked about the kids. I told her Lily had won second place in the math fair. Her eyes lit up genuinely. They must be so proud. That evening, when I repeated the story over dinner, Chelsea folded her napkin precisely. We try not to broadcast family things to outsiders, especially about the kids. No tone, no judgment, just the sound of a door closing quietly somewhere inside my chest. I nodded, passed the potatoes, took smaller bites after that. Sometimes I'd forward links to articles I thought might help: a recipe for eczema-friendly meals, a science kit review for toddlers. There was never a reply. Then one afternoon, my email bounced back with the message, "Sender address not recognized." At the next gathering, I overheard her mentioning she'd updated everyone to a new family thread. I hadn't received an invitation. Once I offered to babysit while they went to a benefit dinner. Chelsea texted the day before Trish offered. She knows their routine better. Next time, maybe. Trish was her cousin. She lived across town. I stopped leaving my porch light on after that. There was a Christmas Eve when the children handed out mugs with names painted in their wobbly handwriting. Dad, Mom, Grandma, Ellie, Grandpa, Joe, Aunt Trish. There wasn't one for me. Matthew handed me a wrapped package. Inside was a pot holder shaped like a cat. The label read, "Gift set assorted." No card. I placed it in the drawer beside the blue birthday card. Even the calendar on the fridge told the story. Marked in pen, Ellie's birthday, Joe's anniversary, Trish's recital, school auction, Chelsea's yoga retreat. My name, written once in pencil, had been erased, not crossed out, just gone. On the 4th of July, the whole family wore matching t-shirts with stars and stripes. I wore a navy blouse. I hadn't known about the shirts. When I arrived, Lily looked up from her sparkler. "Why doesn't your shirt match?" Grandma Chelsea's reply was a soft pat on her daughter's back. "Some people like to do things their own way." Later, Matthew placed a plate in my hands. We made too much potato salad. No one asked if I wanted to stay for the fireworks. I watched them from the porch swing. The flashes reflected briefly in the kitchen window. The screen door stayed shut. I had once embroidered names onto small cloth napkins as a housewarming gift, each one stitched in cursive with thread that matched the children's birthstones. When I visited 2 months later, I found them folded neatly in a bag, labeled seasonal linens. They never came out. Once Chelsea found me wiping down the baseboards before Lily's party. "You don't need to do all this," she said. "It's not your house." I stood. My knees ached from the crouch. I smoothed the rag and placed it back under the sink. She didn't look back. The quiet wasn't loud. It never is. It's the absence of footsteps, the lack of invitations, the way conversation slides past your shoulders like water on wax. I don't recall ever being told not to belong. They simply made it effortless to leave. There's a difference between being forgotten and being edited out. One is neglect. The other is intent. At the start of year meeting for Henry's class, I took my usual seat near the back. I'd arrived early with a notepad and a pen that no longer clicked properly. The folding chairs were arranged in rows. One of the PTA mothers brought lemon bars in plastic wrap, and someone had made a flyer on bright green paper with cartoon pencils at the top. I scanned the emergency contact list tacked to the corkboard. Matthew Harper, Chelsea Harper, Ellie Tannen, Chelsea's mother. My name had been printed in a lighter font. A single line crossed it out with a note in parentheses, "No longer authorized." No explanation. No update. just a thin diagonal slash, like a door being closed quietly, but firmly. I sat through the meeting. I took notes I would never share. The pen left dents in the paper instead of ink. A week later, the phone rang at 8:14 a.m. I picked it up out of habit. The woman introduced herself as someone from the children's preschool. Henry had a mild fever. They'd called both parents. Neither had answered. She needed to confirm who was allowed to pick him up. I offered to come. She paused, then checked a file. "I'm sorry," she said. "You're not on the list anymore." I stood in the hallway, the dial tone humming in my ear. The house was quiet enough to hear the heat clicking through the vents. I walked to the cabinet and opened the tin where I kept my baking soda. For a moment, I looked at the worn measuring spoons resting inside. Then I shut it. I didn't call Chelsea. I didn't want another answer that came dressed as an apology. That afternoon, I called the bank instead. The savings account Walter and I had started years ago, meant as a college cushion for the children, was listed under Matthew's name now. Solely ownership. No joint access. No secondary signatures. The teller's tone was polite practiced. The transfer was approved and completed last quarter. There had been no letter, no message. The last time I had checked the balance was untouched, its interest modest but steady. I had even brought it up once at dinner, unsure whether to call it a gift or a backup plan. Matthew had replied with a quiet nod. Chelsea hadn't looked up from her phone. I dialed his number that evening. It rang 3 times before he picked up. Chelsea thought it'd be easier to consolidate. "You weren't really using it." I waited for him to say more. He didn't. I could hear Lily in the background asking for more juice. A door closed. The line went quiet, and then the call ended. I didn't redial. I wrote the balance down on a piece of paper, not for records, just to see the shape of it. There was a line in the middle of the page from where the pen had hesitated. I didn't sleep much that night. Instead, I pulled the album from the bottom drawer, the red one with the gold trim Walter used to say, "Looked too fancy for family pictures." The first page held a photo of Matthew in his graduation gown. The second, Lily's birth certificate tucked between plastic sleeves. I'd kept every school drawing, every ticket stub, every birthday invitation I'd received. On the 4th page, I found a picture of Henry blowing bubbles on the porch. I'd taken it during one of the early mornings I used to walk him before daycare. He had a curl falling over one eye and soap on his nose. I remembered how he'd laughed, how he reached out to show me each bubble as if it were a treasure. That was the summer before my name disappeared from their contact sheet. I looked through the pages slowly. Some photos had shifted in their slots. One corner had a bit of jam stuck to it, Lily's 2nd birthday, the picnic with the paper lanterns. I touched the glass of the frame. It was cold. A few days later, I received an email from the school district. A form needed to be signed to update medical information. I opened it curious. My section had been marked NA. Beside it, emergency contacts to be provided by legal guardians only. I stared at the screen for a long time. I didn't reply. Instead, I brewed tea. Earl Grey with too much lemon. I let it steep until the water turned the color of bruised wood. Later that week, I passed the park on my way to the post office. Lily and Henry were on the swings. Chelsea was sitting on the bench, talking to a woman I didn't recognize. I paused just long enough to see Henry point at the ice cream truck. Chelsea stood, led them away. She never looked over. I didn't wave. Instead, I kept walking, envelope in hand. I mailed a card to an old friend from Walter's company, someone who'd moved to Oregon. I wrote 3 sentences and underlined none of them. Back at home, I found a note I'd once tucked into my kitchen drawer. Pick up glue sticks, check, library book, due dates, text, Chelsea, recital. I stared at it for a long moment before tearing it in half. Then I threw both halves away, not into the trash, but into the compost, where things break down, disappear, and nourish something else. They didn't yell. They didn't scold. They didn't even correct me. They just erased me slowly enough that no one outside the family would notice, except me. The keys felt heavier than usual that morning. I sat at the kitchen table with the ring in my hand, thumb resting against the one marked back door. The brass had dulled over time, edges softened by years of habit. I turned it once, then again. My fingers knew the weight the way it clinked against the car fob, the curve it pressed into the small pocket of my purse. The hook by the pantry was empty now. I'd taken down the apron I used to wear when baking with Lily, the blue one with the sunflower stitched at the hem. It still smelled faintly of cinnamon and allspice, though I hadn't worn it in months. In the cupboard above the sink, I reached for my notebook, the one with grease-smudged corners and a faded cover. Inside, chicken pot pie on page 6, lemon bars on 12 holiday roast circled in red with Walter's name in the margin. The ink had bled a little, like it had waited too long to be noticed. I placed the notebook in the box beside a mason jar of homemade plum jam and the last photo I had of Walter holding Lily. His collar was crooked, her mouth wide with laughter. I didn't wrap the frame. I let the glass rest bare against the folded towel lining the bottom. By the door, I picked up a scarf. Gray wool, soft but plain. I had knitted it slowly, 1 row per night, that winter. Each stitch held a number, a time, a story. I had meant it for Henry. He liked gray, Chelsea once said. Said it didn't show stains. I folded the scarf carefully, tucked it into wax paper, tied it with twine. No tag, no initials, just the plain weight of something finished. I didn't write a note. At the gas station, I filled the tank, cleaned the windshield with slow strokes. A boy at pump 4 watched me for a while, then turned away. The wind caught the hem of my coat, brushing it against the tires. The drive out of town was quiet. I passed the diner with the broken O in the neon sign, the one Walter used to joke about every time we drove by. I didn't look in the mirror. The road curved slightly to the left, the fields beyond it crisp with dry grass. I pulled up to the porch of Matthew's house late morning. The front step had been swept clean. A new welcome mat, black rubber, no lettering. I placed the package down gently, centered it against the brick. It wobbled slightly before settling. The doorbell was within reach. I didn't press it. I stood still for a moment, hearing nothing but a leaf dragging itself along the concrete. The porch light was off. Back in the car, I rested my hands on the steering wheel without starting the engine. The rearview mirror caught the edge of the mailbox. Someone had taped up a flyer, pink paper edges, curling advertising a tutoring service. I didn't bring any of the other gifts. The books, the puzzles, the tiny sweater with the mismatched buttons. They were in the trunk waiting for another time that would not come. On the drive out of the neighborhood, I passed the school. Children stood in line near the fence jackets tied around their waists. A teacher blew a whistle. None of the voices reached me. The farther I drove, the more the silence settled. It wasn't cold. It wasn't warm. It simply was. At the stoplight, I reached into my coat pocket and found a crumpled receipt from the pharmacy dated last fall. I folded it twice and placed it in the ashtray. The turnoff to the ranch came suddenly. I nearly missed it. The gravel was looser than I remembered, the gate still leaning on its hinges. I stopped just before the drive, watching the wind move through the dry grass like breath across linen. The land hadn't changed much. The mailbox still read Harper, though the paint had begun to peel. Inside, the air smelled of pine and something older. I didn't dust, I didn't sweep. I simply set the box on the table and stood beside it. I removed the keys from my purse. The one to Matthew's back door no longer belonged. I slid it from the ring and placed it beside the plum jam. It looked smaller alone. I didn't keep a copy. On the windowsill, there was a dried sprig of lavender from the garden Walter once planted. I touched it lightly. It crumbled between my fingers. The scarf would be found or it wouldn't. It would be worn or it wouldn't. But it was no longer mine to offer. I boiled water that night, not for tea, but for the sound of it. No goodbyes, no words left behind, no slammed doors, no apologies, no requests. Just a closing that didn't echo. I used to think silence meant something was missing, a gap to be filled, a lull before someone cleared their throat or turned on a light. Now I let it settle. The sound came before the light, the metal spin of the windmill, a long, tired groan as if the air was asking for permission. It circled once, twice, then stilled. I didn't rise quickly. The quilt held the shape of my legs. There was a faint imprint on the pillow, not quite mine yet. I ran my fingers along the frayed edge of the blanket. Walter had mended it once, using mismatched blue thread against faded brown. I hadn't noticed before. I stepped into the hallway, and the floor didn't creak the way I remembered. Or maybe I'd grown heavier. Or lighter. The difference didn't matter. Dust caught the morning light like tiny decisions suspended midair. The sink groaned when I turned the faucet. Cold water first, then rust. I filled the chipped kettle with the clearest stream I could manage. Its handle burned my palm before I remembered to wrap it in a towel. The house didn't smell like anyone. No detergent. No cologne. Just air and wood. The scent of things unused, not unloved. I opened the pantry and found a jar of barley. The lid stuck, but I didn't force it. I reached for a tin of crackers instead, soft at the corners but not spoiled. The label had peeled away, showing only the glue lines like veins. There were no eggs, no milk. But there was time. I swept the front room with a broom so dry the bristles whispered. The dust moved reluctantly. I didn't tell it where to go. I just guided it. The radio on the shelf had no batteries. I pressed the dial anyway. The click comforted me. In the back room, I pulled the covers from the old bed and shook them out over the porch rail. A spider fell curled inward as if embarrassed. I didn't scream. I watched it recover and walk away. I folded the sheets across my arm. My elbow brushed against the window frame. A smear of something old marked the glass. Maybe sap, maybe oil. I rubbed it with the edge of my sleeve. A little of it stayed. On the bookshelf, I found a small wooden box with no keyhole. Inside, a silver button and a ticket stub from a fair I'd forgotten attending. I didn't know if it had been mine or his. I closed the lid and placed it back exactly where it had been. I lit the stove with the long matches from the blue tin. One snapped in my hand. I used another. The flame caught soft and blue. The kettle gave a faint whistle, like someone unsure if they should speak. I poured the hot water over a tea bag I'd found behind the flour canister. The paper tag had faded, but the string held. I cradled the mug in both hands and sat by the window. The windmill turned again. Just once. I peeled an orange with a dull paring knife. The peel came off in uneven strips, some thick with pith. I left them on the napkin. The juice stung a small cut I hadn't noticed on my thumb. I didn't reach for a bandage. The wind brushed the window screen like someone testing for weakness. I opened the drawer in the hallway dresser. Inside was a single glove missing its pair and a piece of folded paper. The handwriting tilted like Walter's, but sharper. If you're reading this, you stayed. Nothing more. No date. No name. I didn't fold it again. I placed it under the sugar jar flat. That afternoon, I wiped down the rocking chair with lemon oil I found in the shed. The rag came back dark. I folded it in on itself and tucked it in a paper bag beneath the sink. The chair creaked under me. The creak matched the windmill. I moved slowly forward back. I counted 27 rocks before I stopped keeping track. There was no sound but wind and wood, no footsteps above, no hum of refrigerator, no voices muffled behind doors deciding what I shouldn't hear. I boiled lentils and ate them plain. I didn't salt them. The taste sat quietly on my tongue. I chewed slowly. I didn't set the table. The napkin lay flat beside the bowl. I folded it after. In the cupboard above the stove, I found Walter's old notebook. The leather had cracked at the spine. Inside were sketches of fence posts, planting maps, lists of things to fix. On the last page, his writing had faded almost entirely, but I made out the words, "If you need quiet, take it." The page wasn't dated. I didn't need to know when he'd written it. That evening, I placed one photograph on the mantel, just one, a copy of the barn taken before the red paint peeled. I didn't frame it. I leaned it against a candle holder. I didn't turn on the lamp. I didn't charge my phone. The dark didn't make demands. I sat with my knees pulled to my chest, wrapped in the same mended quilt, the blue thread brushing my chin. The windmill turned once more. It didn't groan this time. It sang in its own way. I didn't answer it. I just listened. I always thought the sound of the wind rustling dry branches would bother me. But lately, it's been the only thing that doesn't ask for something. The first call came just after I'd taken the last jar of strawberry preserves from the cellar. My hands were still sticky from the lid when the phone buzzed once, then again, like a tap on the shoulder, from someone who didn't want to look me in the eye. I wiped my fingers on the side of my sweater, let the screen light fade, then placed the phone face down on the windowsill. The second call came in the evening. Same number. No message. By the fourth attempt, a voicemail finally appeared. I pressed play, not expecting anything useful. "Mom, it's Matt. Chelsea says you still haven't signed the mineral rights transfer on the old tract. The tax filing deadline's coming up. It'd help if we could wrap that part up soon, okay?" I let the message finish. No hello, no, "How are you?" Just paperwork. The screen showed the familiar image of Matthew's face, an older photo probably taken when he still used Christmas cards. I never changed it, even when the cards stopped. The next message was shorter. Just, "Call me back when you can. It's kind of time sensitive." I didn't. 2 days later, a letter came from a firm I didn't recognize. I knew the format before I even opened it. The kind of paper that folds in thirds, formal enough to skip pleasantries. Inside, a typed request, brief and cordial. Chelsea had authorized legal representation to handle what they described as a necessary adjustment of asset ownership in light of evolving property management obligations. They'd attached a copy of the form with a place for my signature. At the bottom, "We appreciate your cooperation to ensure smooth financial continuity for all parties involved." No note from Matthew. No return envelope. I placed the form under the leg of the rocking chair that tended to wobble. It steadied the tilt. The next call came while I was rinsing out the coffee pot. It buzzed, paused, buzzed again, as if urgency could be mistaken for care. I turned off the ringer. The windmill outside creaked once, twice, then settled into its rhythm. One morning, I walked to the back shed and opened the old metal box where Walter kept ranch documents. Most of it was outdated, hand-drawn plots, ink-stained receipts, a rusted tin holding 3 pieces of turquoise. Tucked in the back was a note in his handwriting. "If you're reading this, then they've found something worth coming back for." The paper had yellowed, but the writing was steady. Beneath it, a map with areas circled, notations he'd scribbled over the years, but never explained. I didn't need to read further. I folded it carefully and placed it between the pages of his field journal. Later that afternoon, another voicemail appeared. We're just trying to get everything squared away. It's not a big deal, Mom. It's just business. No one's trying to make this hard. No one meant me. They weren't trying to make it hard. They were trying to make it final. That evening, I lit a match and held it over the edge of the form. The flame curled the corner before I blew it out. I wasn't looking for drama, just checking if the paper would burn. It did. I kept the document. I didn't sign it. I didn't shred it either. The next week brought silence again, which felt less like peace and more like a reset. I went about my days, sweeping the porch, oiling the pantry hinges, rewinding the radio with a pencil when it jammed. Nothing important, but everything mine. I baked a pie peach not too sweet and ate it slowly over 3 days. I thought of the last time I brought a pie to the city. Chelsea opened the box, took one look, and set it aside. We're doing store-bought this year. It's just simpler. She hadn't looked at me. Only the crust. No one called to say the pie was missed. A week passed. Then 2. Then a card arrived in the mail. Not a birthday, not a holiday. Just a generic thinking of you with a printed message and Chelsea's signature at the bottom. Not a word from Matthew. I placed the card in the drawer with the jar of buttons. It slid easily in between a torn grocery list and a coupon that had expired last spring. Later that night, I made tea in the chipped kettle and watched the steam gather in the air. The spoon clinked gently against the cup, and for a moment, I pictured Walter's hand resting against the table just out of reach. His ring had left a faint groove in the wood. I'd stopped wiping it away. I didn't return the calls. I didn't send back the papers. The land could sit. The taxes could wait. I was not a missing piece. I was the part they'd placed in a box marked sentimental and shoved to the attic until they realized the house still stood on its foundation. They called, but not for me. And I didn't answer. The pipe under the sink didn't give way easily, but I managed. I turned off the valve, pulled out the rusted wrench from the drawer, and twisted until the drip stopped. No one told me to wait for help. No one sighed behind me or reached over to take the tool out of my hand. The only sound was the kettle warming on the stove and the quiet shift of wind outside the window. The list I wrote sat on the counter next to a jar of pinto beans and half a loaf of rye bread. I'd planned the meals for the week in a notebook with torn corners and faint coffee rings from mornings past. Tuesday, white bean stew and sourdough heels. Thursday, lentil salad oranges. Sunday, ham slices with boiled potatoes, and maybe pie if the eggs held out. I didn't mind the quiet. It didn't lean over me like disapproval didn't tap a foot, waiting for me to finish. It just held me and let me be. I moved slower, but not out of fragility. Just caution. My hands still knew the weight of glass jars, the resistance of hinges, the way old wood sounds when it shifts under pressure. An email blinked in my inbox. Dear Mrs. Evelyn, thank you for signing up for the local folk history reading circle. We're excited to welcome you next Tuesday at 10 a.m. The librarian had signed off with a sunflower emoji. I stared at it longer than I should have. I didn't reply. I just highlighted the date in my calendar and folded the paper closed. Clara stopped by late that afternoon. She had a box of shortbread cookies and wore steel-toe boots caked in clay. Her questions about the copper deposits were polite but direct. I poured 2 cups of tea into chipped porcelain mugs and let her do most of the talking. Her eyes scanned the floor plan I'd left out by accident, tracing old fence lines and shaded elevations. She pointed to a contour near the north well. You know, if there's anything of value here, someone will want it. I placed her cup in front of her, adjusted the napkin beneath it. If there's value under this land, I'll see it go to someone who understands what it cost. She didn't answer right away. She didn't have to. The silence that followed wasn't the sharp kind, just the kind that settles between people who understand enough not to intrude further. The wind knocked a branch against the window. I looked at the hinge on the back door. still loose. I made a mental note to fix it next week. After Clara left, I sat at the kitchen table with the radio off. The scarf I'd been knitting lay across my lap, untouched. The light shifted across the floor in a slow diagonal. Somewhere in the attic, a floorboard creaked with the change in temperature. That used to bother me. Now it was part of the house's breath. There was a form I'd been putting off. A local credit union had mailed me an application weeks ago. I opened the envelope and smoothed the paper. I filled it out in pen all the way to the line that asked for the primary account holder. I wrote my name and underlined it. That line had always belonged to someone else. First to my father when I was a girl, then to Walter. After that, Matthew had added his name to the joint account when Walter passed, just until things settled, he'd said. They never did. But this account was mine, no cosigner, no fallback. The pen left a dent where I pressed too hard. I walked out to the old mailbox, slid the envelope inside, and lifted the flag. Then I went back inside, set the kettle on the stove again, and wiped the counter. The smell of rosemary still lingered from lunch. I left the window cracked. Let the wind carry it wherever it wanted. 2 more emails came that night. One from the insurance adjuster Chelsea had forwarded urgent deadline for property disclosure, and another from Matthew Mom. We really need you to cooperate on this. It affects all of us. I didn't open either one. The sound of the windmill creaked once, twice. It spun slow now, but it still turned. I stared at it through the window until it blurred into the horizon line. A voicemail followed the next morning. We're trying to keep this civil, but if you don't respond, we'll have to involve third parties. It's not personal. It's just easier for everyone if you sign. Not personal. Like erasing someone from a school contact list. Like replacing their name with authorized guardian. Like receiving a family photo with only 4 people in it. Like a shared account being drained without a single word. I folded the phone in a dish towel and left it on the counter. I opened the pantry and counted the jars. 7 for winter. Enough for now. Later that day, I sat down to write another list. Not groceries, not chores, just a list of things that belonged to me and no one else. A rocking chair. The drawer full of recipes I never shared. The teacup with the chip on the rim. The scar on my left palm from the Christmas roast in '97. The sound of my own voice in a room where no one interrupts. The wind blew stronger that evening. I moved the plant away from the sill so it wouldn't tip. The old blue cardigan hung on the back of the chair. The sleeves had stretched. One cuff had a loose thread I hadn't noticed before. I didn't pull it. The next morning, I added another item to the list. My time. I never liked the sound of my name when it was used as a placeholder. Mom when convenient. Evelyn when formalities were needed. Not once in those years did I hear it said as though it meant something beyond obligation. The paper had a soft weight in my palm, cream-colored thick, pressed with embossed lines around the edge. I'd folded it 3 times before placing it into the envelope, as if each crease gave it more certainty. I didn't sign it with ceremony-only care. The pen I used had belonged to Walter. A navy barrel silver clip slightly cracked at the cap. I had never used it before. Somehow it still wrote smoothly. At the clerk's office, the waiting room smelled of toner and cold air. A fake plant in the corner wilted beneath dust. The woman behind the desk blinked at the form, flipped it once, and narrowed her eyes. You sure this is how you want to file it? I only want it to be clear. She didn't nod. Just pressed the stamp down with 2 firm hands. It left a red arc over my name. I watched it dry before I slid the folder back into my bag. Nobody followed me out. The air outside tasted clean, but sharp. I passed the bakery without stopping, even though Tuesday meant apple turnovers. My feet led me home like they remembered what to do, even if the rest of me had changed. The teapot rattled on the stove, the lid never quite sitting flat. I poured the water not to drink, but to hear it move. The cup sat untouched as I walked to the desk and pulled out a single sheet of lined paper. No printer, no email. Just ink and quiet. Matthew, I began. Not dear, not my son, not anything dressed up. Just his name. I didn't cross anything out. I didn't draft another copy. I hope you are well. But if you only look for me when something needs fixing, when a paper needs a name or a line needs a witness, then I'm no longer your mother in that story. I'm not angry. I'm simply stepping away from a role I no longer recognize. I won't ask you to understand. I only ask that you don't confuse silence with surrender. The letter fit neatly into a plain white envelope. No return address. I sealed it with the side of my thumb. There was no tremble in my hands. At the post office, the woman at the counter smiled and offered a seasonal stamp with a reindeer. I declined and asked for the simplest one, a white dove barely visible against the background. Back home, I sat in front of the chest of drawers I hadn't opened in months. The drawer stuck a little at the corner, just as it always had. Inside, the photo frame leaned against the edge, 10 faces crammed together on a couch, a banner that read, Thanksgiving 2015, sagging in the background. I slid the photo out from the frame, turned it to the back. My handwriting was still there. Our best year yet. I must have believed it. I used to believe many things. The scissors were already in my hand before I realized it. Not fast, not harsh. I simply trimmed around the shapes, one by one. Chelsea's smile disappeared. First, then Matthew's hand around her waist. I paused before I reached the children. Their faces still had softness, still had time. But I folded them into the edge too. Gently. What remained was Walter's half-profile, his arm thrown casually across the couch, his collar slightly crooked like he hadn't noticed. I cut away the rest and placed his portion into the drawer beside the old harmonica he never learned to play. I didn't shut the drawer immediately. Later that evening, I swept the front porch. No one was coming. The wind tugged at my scarf, and I let it unravel halfway down my back. The chair creaked beneath me when I sat. I didn't rock. I just sat. The sound of tires crunching gravel startled the birds in the pine nearby. A delivery truck paused at the gate, left a box on the step, and left. Inside, a brochure on estate planning addressed to Mrs. Harper and family. I placed it beside the compost bin. When I returned to the kitchen, the teacup was still warm. I drank it cold. The taste didn't matter. The phone rang once, then stopped. No voicemail, no follow-up. The screen lit up with Matthew's name and dimmed again. I turned the phone face down. There was nothing else to do that night. I tucked away the receipt from the filing office, then tore it in half. I didn't need proof for myself. Somewhere above the fridge, Walter's handwriting stared back at me from a torn calendar page. Check on water tank, re-insulate if temps drop. I kept it there, not because of the reminder, but because I remembered the way he whistled through his teeth when he worked like it helped him think straighter. I hadn't heard that whistle in years, but sometimes I imagined it when I fixed the door hinge or replaced the batteries in the smoke detector. He wasn't coming back, but he had left me that sound. I moved through the house with no particular purpose, just the quiet rhythm of knowing nothing waited on the other end of a call. I didn't wear the watch anymore. I folded it into a silk handkerchief and left it in a drawer by the stove. I used the sun now and the chill in my bones. I didn't light a candle. I didn't write in a journal. I simply poured another cup of water, wrapped a blanket over my knees, and stared at the small crack running along the kitchen tile. I didn't need to name what had broken. I only needed to stop pretending it could be repaired. I never realized how loud a quiet morning could be. Not the silence itself, but the sounds that fill the absence of obligation. The kettle clicked as it settled over the stove's iron grate. I didn't time it. I didn't check my watch. I hadn't worn one since I left the house on Sycamore Lane. The mug I used had a chipped rim, which I always turned away from my lips. Walter never noticed the chip, but I still remembered how he used to wipe the rim before handing it over just in case. A breeze nudged the curtain above the sink. The edge fluttered softly against the window frame, brushing the wood like fingertips. I could hear the wind rattle the old tin roof, but the sound didn't unsettle me anymore. It belonged here. I belonged here. The chickens pecked around the dry patch under the crabapple tree. I had sprinkled cracked corn along the fence line that morning, more from habit than strategy. They didn't seem to mind. The floor creaked under my heel as I stepped toward the table. I had already laid out the bills. Electric water, a letter from the library. I opened that one first. An invitation to a regional reading circle next month. I traced the logo with my thumb. The ink was raised slightly. Someone had taken the time to press it in gold foil. The second envelope was from Sadie, postmarked Nevada. Inside a folded paper towel wrapped around 2 lavender cookies, a note scribbled in purple pen, still hunting copper. Miss your oolong. I didn't eat the cookies. I set them beside the teapot, just for the smell. The third item was my ledger. Brown leather, the binding slightly cracked. I had drawn a line down the middle of the last page. On the left, upcoming projects. On the right, repair costs. Under projects, I'd written, Lavender Patch, Westfield, post-thaw. The estimate was conservative. I knew I'd go over budget. I always did when it came to soil. I had scheduled a man from town to help reinforce the chicken coop. Not because I couldn't, but because my knees didn't agree with ladders anymore. I'd written his name in pencil. I could always change my mind. The wind picked up again, brushing loose dust from the windowsill. I didn't move to wipe it. The kettle hissed once, not boiling yet, just remembering how. There was an old envelope tucked between the pages of the ledger. I hadn't noticed it before. The handwriting was unmistakable. Walter's. I didn't need to open it. I already knew what it would say. Still, I unfolded it. Just 6 words. This land was always yours. Quietly. I folded it again and slipped it behind the sugar tin. It didn't need to be read again. The chair beneath me creaked when I sat. I wrapped my fingers around the warm mug. The tea was sharp, not bitter, just honest. I liked it that way. No honey. No need to make things easier than they were. The phone sat in the drawer. It hadn't buzzed in weeks. I hadn't missed it. I hadn't reached for it. No one asked if I needed groceries. No one reminded me to water the porch plants. No one dropped off casseroles, and yet I ate. I read. I stood in the sunlight when it crept across the floor in the late afternoon, and I didn't feel like an afterthought anymore. I had once believed that family made you necessary, that showing up over and over earned you a place. But chairs get moved, pictures get cropped, roles are rewritten, and the kindest thing you can do is step off the stage before the next scene begins. There had been no apology from Matthew, no change in tone, no envelope that began with "I was wrong." What came was paperwork, transfer forms, deadlines, lines for signatures. The voice on the other end of the last voicemail had said, "Let's try to handle this without lawyers. It's just land, just land." I had written back on a yellow sticky note, "Exactly," then filed it with the rest of the papers. I had not cried. Not since the night I folded the dish towel and left it on their porch. Outside, a red-tailed hawk circled low. I watched it disappear behind the tree line. The sky didn't seem bothered by goodbyes. It simply kept going. A knock came 2 weeks ago. I didn't answer. No one left a note. I no longer wait for a car in the driveway. When I harvest mint from the garden, I do it barefoot. The grass is cold in the mornings. I don't flinch. I spoke to the mailman last Thursday. He said no one ever answers from that house up the road. I nodded. That's probably for the best, I replied. He looked at me for a second too long, but didn't ask. In the evenings, I light a single lamp in the hallway, just enough to see the frame above the mantel. Walter in his work shirt, his hands tucked behind his back like he had more to say, but chose not to. There's a comfort in that now silence that doesn't expect. I once thought that the absence of family meant failure, that the quiet was punishment. But now, when I hear the wind rattle the shutters, I hear it say, "You're still here. You chose this." Not because I had nowhere else to be, but because this place with its cracked paint and soft hinges is mine, entirely, undivided, uninterrupted. I poured a second cup of tea. The steam curled against the glass. I didn't think about who might visit, or what might be said if they did. I thought only this. The hardest part wasn't being pushed away. It was learning that I didn't need to be pulled back.